Most horror movies, I don't know why I like to watch all the time. Kidnap 2017 with Halle Berry is just one of those good to average action horror thriller movies to watch for no real reason. Actor Curtis Bedford was in the iconic first Scream movie scene as an extra in the background while they're talking about the rules of horror movies, and he's in this movie Kidnap for like 2 lines of dialogue, just kind of funny. Halle Berry movies are usually good, and she herself has said she likes doing intense horror movie moments the most. Before she started making horror movies like Gothica, Halle Berry wanted to be a news anchor until she took an acting class in college. Now she produces movies under her company 606 Films, the most recent horror movie called Never Let Go in 2024 that didn't do so well. The beginning of Kidnap is like one of those cheesy made-for-television 90s horror movies from Lifetime Network. The music, the dialogue, everything's lifted from the 90s action horror movies, right down to the scary old phones with spooky floppy antennas. But it's not all cheesy horror movie moments. These car chase scenes are like really good and probably why I like watching this action horror movie. The film has the same director of photography in that forgotten 2000 horror movie with Snoop Dogg, Bones. Halle Berry did all of her own stunts during the making of Kidnap, which means pretty much just driving in a straight line, but everybody was doing crazy stuff around her and coming at her like a million miles an hour, so that's some scary stuff. And I like horror movies where they turn the car itself into a villain, almost like a monster movie, like the Stephen King movies Christine or Duel, or I guess The Joyride and even the Rest Stop movies to a lesser degree. Then once Halle Berry gets out of the car, the slasher movie elements come out and Kidnap turns into more of like a suspenseful, atmospheric horror, creeping around with the phone kind of scary movie, like the first Scream. One of the villains looks like he's in the upcoming GTA 6 game. Like, what is that? Sometimes this 2017 horror movie feels like Roseanne or something. Like, I wish they somehow convinced John Goodman to be a horror movie villain. He was so good in that horror sci-fi movie in Cloverfield Lane. But you know that famous scene in Silence of the Lambs where they pull the moth from that person's mouth? The villain in this movie was the same actress laying on the table for one of the most iconic scenes in 80s horror history. But yeah, this movie Kidnap is not exactly the scariest movie I've ever seen. But it is fun to watch. Halle Berry is no doubt a spectacular actress in this action horror movie. Spanish horror director Luis Prieto was trying to make more of like an emotional film instead of a logical one. And I get it, because otherwise, if she did what 99% of most people would do, then this would be a scary movie about waiting around in a police station, which would not be a very good horror film. Anyway, check out Kidnap, streaming for free with other horror movies on Tubi. This underrated science fiction movie, The Angry Red Planet, is one of the classic sci-fi space movies that deserves a mention for its significance in the history of horror, specifically the creature feature's influence on early punk rock, as this is a giant monster movie with one of the creatures making the cover of the first Misfits album with Danzig. With less than 10 days and a low budget to get the sci-fi movie finished, they had to get really creative during the making of The Angry Red Planet. To help cover up the low-budget look of this space horror movie, Danish director Yves McKeown came up with this cheap but cool gimmick they called Cinemagic, where they filmed in black and white and then overexposed the negatives to create this weird reddish-orange glowing footage effect. And all the creepy things hidden in the background are horror animation drawings by hand. The making of this 1950s horror sci-fi movie was filmed well before NASA knew what Mars looks like, so everything was portrayed as this weird jungle forest with all kinds of giant monsters in the movie, ranging from like carnivorous plants to this big bat, spider, crab monstrosity that was just enlarged footage of a puppet marionette on strings, standing about 1 foot 3 inches tall. The Angry Red Planet also manages to work in some scenes that look like The Blob, the classic alien invasion movie that hit the big screen a year before this sci-fi space flick. Another creature feature monster movie Yves McKeown would make 2 years later is Reptilicus, which I would recommend to anyone who likes The Angry Red Planet or cheesy Godzilla ripoff giant monster movies in general. Yves McKeown wrote a horror short that would decades later become Roger Corman's Death Race 2000 in 1975. I think this horror sci-fi movie is underappreciated because it reminds me of the original Star Trek, which would debut about 7 years later. The main protagonist sounds a lot like William Shatner as Captain Kirk, and there's some other weird things that might have inspired the original Star Trek television show. And I'm not making any assumptions, but don't these suits look a lot like the Ghostbusters uniform? Anyway, the Angry Red Planet has some actors from some of the best classic sci-fi movies like The Man from Planet X, and a couple of actors from War of the Worlds, The Amazing Colossal Man, and this silly old black and white 1940s ape horror movie called The Monster and the Girl. So if you don't mind listening to a lot of space talk before any of the horror begins, then check out The Angry Red Planet, one of the more influential low-budget 50s sci-fi movies not recognized often enough for its many indirect connections with the history of horror. The Angry Red Planet is streaming in full for free on a streaming platform I've never heard of before called Zumo that looks pretty much exactly like Tubi. Tony Todd is one of my favorite horror movie actors. I'm a big fan of Candyman movies, and Night of the Living Dead 1990, directed by Tom Savini, is my best zombie horror movie recommendation of all time. So a while ago, I got it in my head that I was going to watch all of the Tony Todd movies, and I got this DVD called The Lost and Found Films of Sarah Driver, who I had never heard before, and I'm glad I did because not only is this the first movie with Tony Todd, but it's also actually very strange and disturbing. Sleepwalk 1986 is a bleak and depressing thriller movie that's a slow burn as our protagonist experiences a string of bad luck while she's translating an ancient cursed Chinese scroll. I don't know why I like watching this indie horror film as much as I do. Maybe it's for the early performances by Tony Todd and Steve Buscemi, which is awesome, but there's something more to it. Oh, this movie also has Ann Magnuson from Panic Room in the 90s Monsters holiday film Scary Little Christmas, and from The Hunger, that David Bowie 80s vampire movie, but something even more than that is why for some reason I like watching this horror movie. In Sleepwalk, everyone's face looks really paranoid, and the camera angles are a great example of German expressionism in horror history. They bring you into the main character's claustrophobic mind frame as her world closes in, so do the horror movie sets. There's a lot of experimental French new wave cinema marked by long one-shot takes and an unpredictable plot. That makes sense because Sarah Driver is an indie horror director who's in the mythology and French horror films and B-horror movies, and that's pretty much what this movie entirely is. This award-winning 80s movie, Sleepwalk, has more psychological horror, and it was her debut piece of excellent neo-noir horror film, plus the first film with Tony Todd, so that makes it worth watching alone. The history of this horror movie, Nightbreed, one of Clive Barker's horror movies, is really strange and weird. With Hellraiser, Clive Barker had proven his point that low-budget horror movies can be scary, and so he was given $16 million to direct a bigger film in Pinewood, England. Listen to how the producers completely ruined it. During the making of Nightbreed, the crew had a lot of momentum and energy from working together on Hellraiser. Doug Bradley, Pinhead from Hellraiser, the personal friend that Clive Barker did plays with before making his horror movies, and so is Simon Bamford, who is the most popular Cenobite Butterball from the Hellraiser movies. This is what he looks like out of the monster costume, and he's holding a small dog who he couldn't get along with behind the scenes because it didn't like him. Clive Barker was constantly making last-second changes to the script for Nightbreed. It was a very chaotic directing style. They were in the final days of filming Nightbreed, and the producers started making changes in the editing room. This was supposed to be a monster movie where the monsters were misunderstood hero protagonists, but the producers changed this in the editing room into a slasher movie, and they added new scenes that were completely changing the story and pushed the runtime up to 2 hours and changed who the main character was. Even Doug Bradley was like, a lot of this movie doesn't make sense with how the producers cut it. And they even cut out all of Doug Bradley's lines. That's not his voice. They added somebody else with this accent to make it sound more like Hellraiser. That's all the producers did. They were like, we don't like what Nightbreed is. We want to do Hellraiser. Director David Cronenberg, who plays a character in Nightbreed, Dr. Decker, remembers that Clive Barker was really upset when he learned about these changes. During the making of Nightbreed, David Cronenberg was writing one of the strangest horror sci-fi movies ever made, Naked Lunch. There's been a re-release of the original Nightbreed that restores it to what Clive Barker wanted to do, but in the meantime, this movie lost $5 million at the box office. I thought it was just me, but the plot literally made no sense at times because of the last-minute changes. Still, I don't know why I like watching this horror movie, but I think it's just the look of it. Underneath all of the abrupt changes to the storyline, Nightbreed still has that Clive Barker style to be found and enjoyed. If you've never seen Nightbreed 1990, it is worth taking a watch, streaming for free on Tubi. River of Darkness is one of the worst horror movies ever in the best way. From the history of this horror movie to its cheesy and campy scenes made on a low micro budget of $30,000, this is one of the worst zombie movies ever, even by indie horror standards, which are pretty low. So listen to this, the Olympic champion and pro wrestler Kurt Angle once dreamed of having a horror movie career himself. I guess he saw Dwayne Johnson movies and thought he could do something better, or at least better than the Doom movie with The Rock. So he founded a company called North Shore Pictures, and he made some really bad horror movies like Endgame, a movie where Kurt Angle cast himself as the villain in a serial killer movie. And then you have River of Darkness, where he's a sheriff who really likes soup at a diner.
This is great turtle soup.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, that ought to give you a small idea of how bad this horror movie truly is. Complete, unintentional horror comedy. They really were trying to make a scary movie, and it failed, and there's plenty of memorable horror movie quotes from River of Darkness like this.
Think fish have souls?
That should have been the name of the horror movie. Do Fish Have Souls? By Kurt Angle. I don't know. I don't even know. So even wrestler Kevin Nash said he knew this was going to be a really bad horror movie when the zombie character he was playing came out of the water like Friday the 13th with completely dry hair, and he correctly predicted this film was going to be made-for-television horror, direct-to-video at Walmart, which it was. Sid Vicious had nicer things to say, and he just simply enjoyed wandering off and scaring random fishermen in Pittsburgh during the making of River of Darkness. The filming of this movie took 2 days, and he said the zombie makeup wouldn't come off until 2 days after they were finished, so he just had to look like this for about 48 hours later. On the positive side, it's a cheesy zombie slasher film that has Bill Heinzman, who was this zombie from the beginning of the original 1968 Night of the Living Dead movie by George Romero, and he's working alongside some pro wrestlers who are zombies. River of Darkness has one independent horror movie actress that nobody's probably heard of named Alan Rowe Kelly, who I remember from a 70s indie horror film I saw once called Don't Look in the Basement. That is probably like one of the most controversial, just strangest low-budget indie horror films you've never watched, and never should, to be honest, but I kind of like that horror movie, and if you like this terrible horror movie, River of Darkness, then you might like Don't Look in the Basement. Just another terrible low-budget horror movie. So somehow River of Darkness did not catapult North Shore Pictures or Kurt Angle to the top of the indie horror film industry, and Kurt Angle closed the studio down a couple of years later. In other words, no River of Darkness 2. Kevin Nash says there's no way to enjoy this bad horror movie at all, but if you want to try, then this zombie flick is one of the many bad horror movies streaming for free on Tubi. The People Under the Stairs, 1991, ranks among the best of Wes Craven movies, but it's also one of his more forgotten films. After The Hills Have Eyes and Nightmare on Elm Street, nobody knew what to expect next from the creator of the Freddy Krueger movies. A horror comedy about getting hunted in a giant mansion is what they got, and the horror film made $31 million, earning back its $6 million budget in the first opening weekend of hitting the big screen. Wes Craven's The People Under the Stairs was a lot more fun for him to write than to direct. Any movie dealing with younger actors and animals and dim lighting and a bunch of hallways is difficult, and the Los Angeles house was stiflingly hot with little ventilation. The People Under the Stairs was originally titled The Puzzle because of this creepy house with all of its hidden passages. Being all cramped up in tight spaces adds to the psychological horror of not knowing what's around the next turn, and it makes this movie pretty tense and suspenseful and confusing in a good horror movie style. This is a horror movie that's based on a true story of a 1978 household that really did keep their family stuck inside all of the time. That's what gave Wes Craven the original idea, and he just went wild with it into this crazy movie. He had a bit of writer's block, so he finished the rest of the scary movie in his head in a dream, which I guess is appropriate for the director of Nightmare on Elm Street. The best 80s horror movie special effects artists at KMBX did a lot of work to make The People Under the Stairs look scary. They had to do all of this special sculpting for the extra large faces, and the making of this horror film required like dentures for each of the people under the stairs, and basically zombie makeup to look pale, which took 6 hours a day to put on for everybody each. This movie has Sean Whalen as Roach. He was Lion McPoyle in It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, but he did other horror movies like the Halloween 2 remake, and he was in Hatchet 3 and the teen horror comedy Idle Hands in 1999. Actor Everett McGill played the Reverend in the Stephen King werewolf movie The Silver Bullet, and Swedish actor Jan Burke was in Slumber Party Massacre 3. And if you've ever watched The Dentist 2 or Vampire in Brooklyn, then you've seen actress Wendy Robbie. Out of all of them though, Kelly Jo Minor probably has had the best horror movie career because she was in A Nightmare on Elm Street 5 and The Lost Boys. Meanwhile, Ving Rhames maybe has the best job at all because he went from the Dawn of the Dead remake to doing Arby's commercials now, where he talks about meat specials real loud and gets paid a lot. The actor who played the main protagonist, Fool, didn't really do any other horror movies, but he was in like The Sandlot and The Mighty Ducks, so that's where his career went after this Wes Craven film. The People Under the Stairs is certainly not the scariest of Wes Craven movies, but it definitely is the most bizarre, and it has some of the strangest things ever caught on camera in any of his movies. It's shocking, but like, it's meant to be funny and scary at the same time. So see it for yourself and watch this horror movie streaming for free on Tubi. Out of all the great George Romero movies, Bruiser is the 2000 horror movie that he himself liked making most. Bruiser was one of the few times where he got all the creepy things caught on camera exactly as he wanted them to be watched, on a meager $5 million budget, which is a low budget for a George Romero movie. Most of the making of Bruiser took place in this rented mansion of a Toronto family who had no idea what George Romero movies were really about. They were still living downstairs while he was filming all of these various interior locations, from doing scary stuff for about a week. Like this saw blade on the floor wasn't even his, it was theirs, and he just kept using it. He just put it in the scripts because he thought it was cool. The word Bruiser, he just heard it from his daughter, which she said meant cool, so he decided to just make that the title of his movie and do, I guess, what he thought was cool things, just a horror drama that slowly transformed into a really weird comedy. The Misfits once again play their part in the history of horror by lending their own soundstage for these scenes to help George Romero save on Bruiser production costs. Since this is 2000, it's no longer with Danzig, but Michael Graves. Still cool. This was an indie horror movie where George Romero was really allowed to just do whatever he wanted without studio interference, so he did some extra weird things. It's one of those possession movies where they get trapped in this mask, and it's clearly inspired by Phantom of the Opera, and then this George Romero movie has like a combination of gothic and neo-noir horror, especially when Tom Atkins does his usual detective routine. Other times this movie looks like The Invisible Man. And when we first see Tom Atkins and Bruiser, behind him there's this detective eating a sandwich. It's exactly like Night of the Creeps. Actor Jason Fleming had to do extremely exaggerated movements to make this mask move for these Bruiser scenes. They went through a lot of different designs, and they had actually already filmed quite a few of the scenes with a different colored pink mask, when George Romero just made the decision to change it to white because he was thinking about mimes. No, seriously, like mimes were what he was thinking about. Made this mask for Bruiser. So I don't know why I like watching this horror movie. I don't even know if I like watching this horror movie, even though I've seen it a bunch of times. It's just much different than the other George Romero zombie movies, obviously. I think my favorite George Romero movie really is Martin. If you like possession movies and horror fantasy, then this is an interesting movie to watch, I guess. When it's not being absurd, the movie has this very distinctive, like, chilling atmosphere cast in heavy blue lighting. It gives the scariest, like, movie scenes washed out, emotionless tone that matches his mask. George Romero wanted this to be like a depressing, atmospheric horror movie, and I think he kind of succeeded, but it's weird to make that a comedy. Anyway, you can check out Bruiser 2000 movie streaming for free with other scary George Romero movies on Tubi. Some of the best old black and white horror movies ever star Vincent Price. Movies like The Mad Magician, though not his absolute best, are early in his horror movie career and still fun to watch and analyze. This was before he became the famous breakthrough horror icon, and speaking of breaks, Vincent Price had a rather tough break during the making of The Mad Magician. Starring opposite of Vincent Price is Patrick O'Neal, who was also in some other great horror movies like Chamber of Horrors in the 60s and The Stuff, a cult classic 80s horror comedy that's a great creature feature if you like any of the Blob movies. Anyway, Patrick O'Neal unintentionally cracked Vincent Price with a table during one of the Mad Magician scenes, and Vincent Price had to get an operation to correct his nose. This movie, The Mad Magician, is important in the history of horror because this event is what gave the actor his distinctly iconic nasally voice, and it's probably why nobody can do a proper impression of him. Speaking of Vincent Price's unique voice, if you were ever wondering what accent does Vincent Price have, he has what's called a transatlantic accent. He was born in Missouri, but that's not the accent Vincent Price movies have. Sometimes it's called mid-Atlantic, but transatlantic is actually a made-up dialect that combines American and British accents into an accent that doesn't exist. They would sometimes use it for like radio announcements, and Vincent Price learned it for stage plays before he did movies. The other character in The Mad Magician, who is Vincent Price's arch nemesis, is played by the same actor who was the general in The Deadly Mantis. So if you've never watched that old black and white monster movie, I would highly recommend this creature feature from the 1950s, The Deadly Mantis, especially if you like creepy bug movies. So anyway, another reason to like The Mad Magician is the German director John Bram, who made 12 episodes of The Twilight Zone, 5 of which were first season. And this 50s horror movie he made has a very similar, eerie sort of Twilight Zone feel in terms of that deliberately slow pacing and build-up and rigid dialogue. This movie has gothic horror elements too, but it's more of like a suspense thriller. Vincent Price learned for this movie how to do a lot of magic tricks to convincingly play his villainous role. There are some classic horror movie moments in The Mad Magician, a 3D horror movie just like House of Wax was 3D, one of the greatest Vincent Price movies ever. The Mad Magician has the House of Wax writer and the same camera operator, one of the few who knew how to work the giant 1950s 3D cameras, which were new at the time. This isn't the scariest movie ever, but it has its place in horror movie history for helping shape the career of Vincent Price, who really wasn't interested in doing horror movies until after his success with House of Wax, followed by this film. This movie helped to put him back on the big screen and into the spotlight, where he really got his big break with horror movies. Check out The Mad Magician streaming for free with other black and white movies on Tubi. Hideous is a completely silly and outrageous horror comedy directed by Charles Band from his indie horror studio Full Moon Pictures. This late 90s horror movie is extra cheesy with deliberately over-the-top campy acting and a script so sleazy and random it reminds me of Jess Franco movies. Hideous makes no attempt to explain itself for most scenes, and that's why it's still entertaining decades later, a good bad horror movie. If you've ever wondered what the actor who was Benny in Total Recall was up to, he went from that sci-fi movie to star in this horror movie, Hideous, as a powerful collector of various biological oddities, or mutants in other words, and these creatures are low-budget horror movie puppets. Charles Band's favorite horror movie of all time is King Kong 1933, so I'm guessing that's where his lifelong obsession with making creature features begins. Charles Band movies are hit or miss. Some are good, some aren't. He had success with 80s horror movies like Puppet Master, a franchise that's still making new and upcoming horror movies today, and with Ghoulies, which had a popular first 2 horror movies and then another 2 horror movie sequels. Hideous was seeking to recapture these classic horror movie moments. While they don't come close to the villains in Demonic Toys, one of my favorite Full Moon pictures ever, Hideous definitely has strange creatures caught on camera. Most of the budget was spent on Baby Hawk, who is basically a combination of Pinhead from Puppet Master and Baby Oopsie Daisy from Demonic Toys. The rest of the budget probably went into CGI effects with Doubleface, a giant whispering head who seems to control the other monsters in this movie. The dolls don't really move all that much, and they're covered in slime and shadows to hide their low-budget looks for the most part, but somehow it all works on a cheesy, low-budget horror movie level. Charles Band was born into the low-budget movie business, and he definitely knows how to make an idea entertaining, no matter how absurd. His father, Albert Band, once made a black and white horror movie I really like called I Bury the Living, moved his family to Italy when Charles Band was younger, and there he made some European filmmaking connections. So for the making of Hideous, Charles Band returned to his studio in Romania where it's very cheap to film, and this is the same Romanian castle location as his 90s vampire movies Subspecies and Castle Freak, both of which are great horror films I'd recommend if you've never seen a single full moon feature monster movie before. Much better than Hideous. But don't get me wrong, while Hideous is no doubt another attempt at selling full moon merchandise, in a lot of ways it was one of the last great goofy Charles Band movies of the 90s. He would make another good effort at a puppet franchise in 1999 with Blood Dolls. After that, Full Moon went into overdrive where they just began pumping out seriously like 20 new horror movies a year. Hideous has a special place in horror history for Full Moon fans because in many ways it's the last movie that truly feels like a classic Full Moon Features film, made for this kind of niche Charles Band audience. If you want to see a porcupine slasher movie puppet and some of the campiest acting this side of 1997, Hideous is streaming for free on Tubi and Amazon Prime. The Mr. Vampire series is perhaps one of the greatest and best kept secrets in the history of horror. Chinese vampire movies. These supernatural movies combining Chinese vampire lore and kung fu are called Jiangshi, which translates into hopping Chinese vampire. And these are the classic 80s vampire movies that not many people have heard about before. I did some research and found out that the hopping vampire myth in this movie is a Chinese legend with a disturbing backstory that's a pretty good idea for a vampire film. So when the wealthy passed away, they were transported standing up with a pole under each arm, and they were ran on foot as fast as possible to the morgue. Like, that's actual historical fact. So from a distance, the bodies looked like they were hopping as they ran, hence the legend of the hopping vampire. I like 80s vampires and I like jumping. I guess blame it on Castlevania. And these horror movie scenes remind me of Ghostbusters with the way they suck the ghosts into traps with a similar laser effect. The possession movie scenes use this blue lighting with blue face paint on the ghost characters. It has a unique style that's familiar at the same time. It's like if Bruce Campbell movies had kung fu. But for some reason I like watching Mr. Vampire 3, probably because it was my introduction to the series and I was just so confused and entertained at the same time. But they do weird things like deep fat fry a ghost and it becomes like The Mummy, just weird cartoonish horror movie scenes and moments that are just absolutely ridiculous. At the same time, they work other like Chinese urban legends into this horror comedy movie, like mirrors, which ghosts fear because it transports them into another dimension, and you can just cover yourself in ash if you want to hide from a ghost. So those are all things I learned from watching this movie. So when I found out more about the folklore behind this subgenre, it made me like these foreign horror movies even more. For other movies in the Jiangshi genre, try Adventures of the Spooky Kind, 1980, and that's the best horror movie name I've ever heard. And there's a Japanese horror movie in 2013 called Rigor Mortis that's a tribute to Mr. Vampire series. So start with any of those, or you can just dive into it with Mr. Vampire 3, where they just get absurd. The other two movies after that are just okay. They're good horror movies.